There is a standard explanation for why the great railway stations of the 19th century were built the way they were. Industrialization was accelerating. Cities were growing. Governments and private rail companies wanted to project confidence, permanence, and national ambition through architecture. The stations were large because the age demanded largeness. That explanation is taught in schools, repeated in architecture journals, and accepted without much friction. Until you look at the numbers. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. When the Gare du Nord in Paris was rebuilt and expanded in 1864, it was designed to handle what engineers at the time described as a projected volume of travelers appropriate to a fully industrialized, densely connected European capital. Reasonable enough. But the volume those engineers were designing for would not actually arrive at that station, by recorded passenger count, until somewhere between 1920 and 1930. That is not a rounding error. That is a gap of over 50 years between capacity and demand. You might say, forward-thinking design. You might say they built for the future. And that answer works. Until you notice it isn't one station. It isn't one country. It isn't one decade. The question worth sitting with is this, not whether individual stations were ambitious, but whether a pattern of systematic overpreparation across unconnected cities, in multiple countries, within the same narrow window of years, carries a different kind of weight than ambition alone. Let's begin where the record is clearest. In 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened what is broadly considered the first intercity passenger railway in the world. Crown Street Station in Liverpool was modest. It was a functional structure, sized for novelty, for experiment, for the uncertain early years of a technology that hadn't yet proven itself commercially. That makes intuitive sense. Early infrastructure often starts small. What happened over the following 2 decades, however, does not follow that same logic cleanly. By the 1840s and into the 1850s, stations were being constructed across Britain, and simultaneously across France, the German states, Belgium, and the Austro-Hungarian territories, at a scale that consistently exceeded the populations they were serving at the time of construction. Not slightly. Not by a margin that a confident investor might reasonably wager on. By factors that, when laid against contemporary census data and actual rail usage records from the opening years of those stations, produce a persistent and noticeable gap. Huddersfield Railway Station in Yorkshire, England, completed in 1850, was designed with a neoclassical facade stretching approximately 416 feet. In 1851, the census recorded Huddersfield's population at roughly 30,000 people. The station's architectural treatment, its colonnade, its proportions, its civic grandeur, was commensurate with cities several times that size. Local historians have long noted this. The standard interpretation is civic pride, regional competition, and the ambitions of the local landed class. Those explanations exist. They are documented. But the consistency of that explanation appearing across dozens of similar cases begins to invite a different kind of attention. Scale mismatches alone are not unusual in history. Monuments are often outsized. Cathedrals were never purely functional. Ambition in architecture is as old as architecture itself. What makes the railway station pattern worth examining more carefully is not size alone. It is the combination of size, timing, and operational specificity. A monument can be large without being functional. A cathedral's nave can be cavernous without needing to process 10,000 visitors on a Tuesday morning. But a railway station's size is not merely symbolic. Platform length determines how many carriages can dock simultaneously. Concourse width determines sustainable passenger flow per hour. Roof span determines how many parallel tracks can operate beneath covered infrastructure. These are engineering decisions. They have operational consequences. They are not decorative choices dressed up as practicality. When a station is designed with 6 platforms in a city that, at the time of its opening, generates traffic requiring perhaps 2, the excess is not ornamental. Look at the railway expansion across the eastern United States in the latter half of the 19th century. The transcontinental ambition is well understood, linking coasts, opening territory, enabling settlement. That narrative has a clear demand logic. Population was moving west. Infrastructure had to anticipate and enable it. But look more carefully at the stations built in towns that were not on the transcontinental corridors. Secondary lines, branch lines, regional connectors linking smaller settlements to larger hubs. Some of these stations, built in the 1870s and 1880s, are structurally substantial in a way that defies the economic rationale of branch line investment. Brick construction, elevated platforms, covered waiting areas, ticket halls with ceiling heights that suggest volume, formality, permanence. The towns they served at the time of construction were small. Some remain small. The stations have outlasted the traffic they were supposedly built to handle. There is an analytical posture worth adopting here, not skepticism of the historical record, but a different kind of attention to what the record actually contains. It is structural. It is built into the foundation. And the records show this was not rare. Frankfurt's Alter Bahnhof, opened in 1839, was designed with spatial provisions that contemporaries themselves noted seemed to anticipate a density of use the city would not reach for decades. Vienna's early rail terminals in the 1840s were similarly described in engineering reviews of the period as constructed to a standard disproportionate to immediate need. Milan, Brussels, Amsterdam, the pattern repeats within a tight geographic and temporal cluster. What is notable is not just that each city overbuilt. What is notable is that they overbuilt by similar margins in similar architectural languages, using similar structural approaches at nearly the same time. The Industrial Revolution, moving at the pace it actually moved, not the pace it is sometimes retrospectively described as having moved, did not produce uniform demand signals across all these cities simultaneously. Population growth was uneven. Commerce was uneven. Yet the station-building response was strikingly, almost suspiciously, consistent. That consistency is what draws researchers back to these buildings. There is one further dimension that the scale argument alone does not fully address, and it is perhaps the most quietly difficult to explain away. Many of these stations were not simply large. They were finished in ways that excess capacity alone would not require. Interior stonework, ceiling heights, decorative ironwork integrated structurally into load-bearing elements rather than applied afterward. Floor materials laid across concourse areas that, in the early years of a station's operation, saw perhaps a fraction of the foot traffic such materials were rated to sustain. These were not corners left for later expansion. These were completions, as if the design assumed from the outset that the space would be occupied fully in the near term. When historians describe this as optimism, they are not wrong. Optimism is a reasonable human explanation. But optimism typically varies. Between cities, between investors, between political climates. Optimism is, by its nature, inconsistent. The stations were not inconsistent. That may mean nothing. It may be entirely explained by shared architectural schools, shared engineering manuals, shared European design culture circulating through journals and professional networks. Or it may mean that the question of why these buildings were sized the way they were has an answer that sits just slightly outside the frame we are currently using to look at it. To understand why the European pattern matters, it helps to first understand what that pattern should not have been able to do. Architectural and engineering knowledge in the mid-19th century did not travel instantly. There was no standardized international building code for railway infrastructure. There was no central planning body coordinating station design across sovereign nations. The firms responsible for these buildings were largely regional. The financiers were local or national. The political motivations differed from country to country, sometimes from city to city. By every structural reason we would expect to produce variation, these projects should have varied considerably. They did not. And when you move the examination westward, across the Atlantic into the United States, and northward into the developing rail corridors of Britain's industrial heartland, the pattern does not weaken. It follows. The United States presents a particularly concentrated version of what the European record only partially shows. By the 1870s and 1880s, American cities were constructing railway terminals that, even allowing for the famously rapid growth of the American frontier, were outpacing their immediate populations with a consistency that contemporary observers occasionally noted and then declined to dwell on. Cincinnati Union Terminal, though completed in 1933, was designed in a period of planning that reflected decisions made a full generation earlier. Decisions about scale, about capacity, about the volume of human movement the building would need to sustain. At its opening, the terminal was processing a fraction of the passenger volume it had been engineered to accommodate. Within 2 decades of its completion, passenger rail in America had begun its long structural decline. The terminal reached something close to its design capacity for only a narrow window of years. The building had been sized, in other words, for a future that arrived briefly and then departed. That is one station. But the examples accumulate. Grand Central Terminal in New York, opened in 1913, is frequently cited as an example of visionary civic planning. Facilities that look, in the photographs from their opening years, slightly too large for the streets they anchor. The standard explanation here often invokes civic boosterism, the American tendency to build aspirationally, to project confidence, to attract settlers and investors through visible infrastructure. Build it and they will come. That explanation is not wrong. It has strong documentary support. But it raises the same follow-on question. Boosterism is a sentiment. What produced the specific scale decisions? The ceiling heights? The platform lengths? The choice to use dressed stone in a settlement that had, at the time of construction, no architectural tradition to match it? Sentiment does not specify dimensions. Something else does. There is a particular category of station worth examining more carefully, what railway historians sometimes call junction stations, built at the intersection of 2 or more lines. These were, by definition, designed for transfer traffic as much as origin or destination traffic. They needed to accommodate passengers moving between trains rather than simply arriving or departing. Its 2-level track system, its 44 platforms, its concourse dimensions, all of it is explained through the lens of New York's explosive growth and the ambitions of the Vanderbilt rail interests. Those explanations are accurate in their particulars. New York was growing. The Vanderbilts were ambitious. Rail traffic through Manhattan was genuinely increasing. But the terminal was designed for a peak it would reach in the 1940s and never again sustain. The infrastructure was complete, fully operational, and largely correct for a demand window of perhaps 15 to 20 years at its highest point. For a structure built to last centuries, that window is narrow in a way that the celebratory histories of the building rarely pause to examine. Washington Union Station, opened in 1907, seats a similar question. At its opening, Washington, D.C. was not a city of commuters. It was a government seat with a modest permanent population and a highly seasonal pattern of official visitors. The station was built to a scale that architectural critics at the time acknowledged was extraordinary for the city it was serving. The standard explanation, federal ambition, symbolic importance of the capital, is offered and accepted. It explains the impulse. It explains the decision to build large. It does not fully explain the operational specificity of the sizing. Britain, in this same period, was producing something worth examining in parallel. St. Pancras Station in London, completed in 1868, is routinely described as one of the greatest feats of Victorian engineering. The Barlow roof, a single-span iron arch covering the entire train shed, was, at the time of its construction, the widest single-span roof in the world. The engineering achievement is undeniable. What is less frequently foreground is the question of why that particular span was necessary. The Midland Railway, which commissioned St. Pancras, was not the largest or most financially powerful rail company in Britain at the time. Its traffic projections, based on contemporary records, did not obviously demand a roof of that scale over a shed of that width. The roof was built not to meet existing demand and not simply to accommodate projected growth, but at a specification that went beyond both, a specification that the Midland's own engineers reportedly described as exceeding what the anticipated traffic would require. They built it anyway, and the building endures, which is, perhaps, one way of reading the decision, that they built beyond need because they understood permanence in a way that short-term demand calculations could not capture. But permanence built into a structural decision requires a belief that the use will come. It requires a model of future occupation that justifies the investment before that occupation exists. Where that model came from, and why it appeared reliably across so many projects in so many cities, is a question the buildings themselves do not answer. There is a phrase that sometimes emerges in urban planning literature when analysts try to describe the gap between infrastructure provision and contemporary demand: supply preceding stimulus. The idea that in certain historical periods, infrastructure was laid down not in response to existing need, but in anticipation of need that had not yet materialized, and that this anticipation was somehow systematically correct. Standard economic history attributes this to speculative investment, to the particular psychology of railway mania, to boosterism and frontier optimism in the American context. These are real forces. They shaped real decisions. But speculative investment typically produces waste. It produces excess that fails. Buildings abandoned, lines never used, terminals that stand half-empty for generations. The railway stations of this period, by and large, did not fail in that way. They were used. The demand arrived. Not always immediately. Not always fully. But the buildings were not wrong. They were, in most cases, correctly sized, just early. Correctly sized and early. That phrase carries more weight than it initially appears to. When researchers began grouping these observations, not just the architectural scale but the geographic spread, the temporal clustering, the operational specificity, the consistent early sizing, they found themselves reaching for a framework that standard architectural history had not fully provided. Some began to examine whether these patterns might reflect not individual ambition multiplied across cities, but something more structural. A shared inheritance, perhaps. A set of assumptions about the built environment that was already in place when the railway age began. Assumptions about scale, about movement, about how large a building needed to be to serve a functioning human system. Some of those researchers, working outside mainstream academic channels, began applying a label to what they were seeing. That label, and what it does and does not mean, is where this examination has to go next. The word Tartaria does not appear in mainstream architectural history textbooks. It does not appear in the engineering records of the Midland Railway, or in the planning documents of Washington Union Station, or in the correspondence of the firms that designed the great terminal halls of Paris and Frankfurt. It is not a term that professional historians of the 19th century use when describing the railway building boom. It is, instead, a term that has emerged from a particular kind of reading. A reading that takes the patterns we have been examining and asks whether they might point towards something that the standard historical framework has not yet fully accounted for. To engage with that term seriously, it is necessary to be precise about what it is and what it is not. Tartaria, as it appears in contemporary alternative historical discourse, refers loosely to an interpretive label, a shorthand applied by certain researchers and online communities to a collection of observations about 19th century built infrastructure that seem, to those researchers, to resist clean explanation through conventional historical narratives. It is not, in the usage of most who employ it seriously, a claim about a specific empire, a named civilization, or a geographically bounded political entity. It is closer, in its most careful applications, to a question mark placed over a period of history that some researchers feel has been described too smoothly. The label itself has a historical antecedent. On early modern European maps produced between roughly the 16th and 18th centuries, large portions of Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of Eastern Europe were marked under the designation Tartaria or Grand Tartary. These were not precise political designations in the way that France or the Ottoman Empire were. They were cartographic catch-all terms for regions that European mapmakers knew existed but had not thoroughly documented. The label described, in a sense, the edge of known administrative detail, the zone where confident record-keeping gave way to approximation. Some researchers have noted this with interest. That a label historically associated with the boundaries of documented knowledge is now being applied to a gap in architectural and infrastructural knowledge carries a certain internal logic, whether or not that logic leads anywhere conclusive. The interpretations that circulate under this label vary considerably in their claims and in their rigor. One interpretation holds that the scale of 19th century infrastructure reflects a prior civilizational layer, a period of organized, large-scale habitation that predates the official historical record of the cities in which these buildings stand, and that the buildings themselves were not constructed new but adapted, restored, or inherited from that prior context. This interpretation points to the speed of certain construction timelines, the sophistication of certain engineering solutions, and the consistent scale across geographically separated sites as evidence of something older underlying the Victorian surface. A second interpretation is considerably less dramatic. It proposes simply that the historical record of the mid-19th century is less complete than it appears, that certain institutional arrangements, certain shared design standards, certain networks of knowledge and capital that coordinated the railway building boom have not been fully documented by mainstream historiography, and that what looks like mysterious consistency might in fact reflect coordination that has simply not yet been traced to its sources. In this reading, Tartaria is not a civilization but a gap in the archival record, not in history itself. A third interpretation, favored by some architectural historians who engage with these questions at the margins of their field, suggests something more modest still, that the railway age inherited certain assumptions about monumental scale from earlier institutional building traditions, ecclesiastical, military, imperial, and that these inherited assumptions were applied to the new technology of rail without anyone consciously designing a system. The consistency in this reading is the consistency of a shared professional culture, not a shared origin. The scale is not evidence of a prior world. It is evidence of how deeply the past shapes what we build even when we believe we are building something entirely new. None of these interpretations is, at present, definitively supported or definitively excluded by the available evidence. That is an uncomfortable place to stand. And it is worth being honest about why. We are accustomed to historical questions having answers. We are accustomed to the 19th century in particular being a well-documented period. A period of newspapers, of censuses, of engineering journals and parliamentary records and company accounts. The railway age is not ancient history. It is not the Bronze Age where gaps in the record are expected. It is recent enough that the absence of clean answers to questions about scale and timing feels, to some researchers, like a more active kind of silence. That feeling, that the silence is somehow shaped rather than simply empty, is, in part, what drives the communities that have gathered around the Tartaria label. Not necessarily the specific claims those communities sometimes make, which vary from the cautious to the extraordinary, but the underlying intuition, that a pattern this consistent, this widespread, this operationally specific, deserves a more thorough examination than mainstream historiography has so far given it. Whether that intuition is correct is not something this examination can resolve. What it can do is note what remains. The stations are still standing. St. Pancras still spans its original iron arch. Grand Central still runs its lower-level tracks. The Gare du Nord still processes the passenger volumes it was, somehow, designed to accommodate more than a century and a half before those volumes became real. The buildings outlasted the demand curves that justified them, and then the demand curves caught up, and now some of the buildings are outlasting the rail industry itself. Repurposed, listed, protected, preserved. They were built beyond their moment.